Oh man, where do I even begin with the Vegas Eternal? A team so bad that it rivals the 0-40 Shanghai Dragons. The Eternal had some terrible management, poor roster choices, setting their own players up for failure, and leaving those poor players to basically fend for themselves. They got so bad that the general manager had to step in and play a match. Unfortunately for all fans of this cursed franchise, the end of their existence went out with a sad and pathetic whimper, not a bang. However, it wasn't always this way. The Eternal were once the lovable underdogs, full of up-and-coming talent. The early years showed lots of fun European players like Soon, Ben Best, FD God, and LH Cloudy. This team wasn't winning any stages, but they had a competitive match, and they were enjoyable to watch. In 2020, the Paris Eternal took a big step forward. They signed multiple Korean rookies, including future superstars Sparkle, Onbin, Xe, and Fielder. This team shifted into a half Korean, half French core with Smex, and they were a sleeper good team for most of the year. The highlight of their season, and the highlight of the entire franchise, came during the 2020 Summer Showdown. At this point in the year, they were a respectable 9-6, and they entered the tournament as the 8th seed. They were kinda on a hot streak, and no one wanted to face them. They swept through the Vancouver Titans and Dallas Fuel, before upsetting the defending champion San Francisco Shock and moving on to the finals to face off against the dominant Philadelphia Fusion. This was one of the single best games in Overwatch history, and I plan to make a video fully going over and breaking down this insane match, so subscribe if you want to see that. Okay, so the Summer Showdown Finals went on for a full 7 maps, and it all came down to a tiebreaker on Rialto. And despite some hefty heroics from EQO, the Paris Eternal came out on top and won their first stage title. Little did they know, though, it was all downhill from here. The 2020 season continued, and the Eternal played pretty well, but they just couldn't get over the hump, and they'd get eliminated early in the 2020 playoffs. Despite the early exit, this team had a pretty good season, and fans were optimistic. Until the Paris Eternal announced that they would be dropping the entire 2020 roster in an attempt to save some money. Suffice to say, Eternal fans were not happy, watching as their brand new Korean superstars all moved to the Dallas Fuel, and watching a lot of their French talent leave for other teams. Still, the roster they signed during the offseason wasn't all that bad. They signed great players like Don and Khan, who not only had cool matching names, but they were solid above average players. Naga and Onigod were a pretty fun DPS line, and mid-season, they picked up a young Vestola and Dredro, which would prove to be a really smart move. If you know about Vestola now, crazy to think that this team had him back in the day. This team was definitely a step back from the 2020 squad, but fans were optimistic that they could snag a couple wins. They weren't like a super great team. They would win some games, they would lose some games, but my personal favorite moment in this season was when they reverse swept the LA Gladiators in one of the biggest upsets of the year. The LA Gladiators were looking as like tournament favorites. They were one of the best teams in the league, and Naga and Vestola were on something during that match. All things considered, this team was really likable, a fun underdog you wanted to root for. I never found myself disliking the Eternal. I'd always want them to go for that upset or to beat those bottom tier teams. And at the end of the season, they finished with a respectable 8-8 record. They barely missed the playoffs, and they finished 12th in the league. Unfortunately for Eternal fans, the pain really begins now. During the 2021 offseason, they only made a couple of small moves, releasing Onigod and signing Glister as his replacement. On paper, this was an upgrade. Glister looked like an up-and-coming talent. He had played really well on London, and although he had a bit of a down year on the San Francisco Shock, he looked like he would be a good improvement for this team. The Eternal were seen as like a middle-of-the-pack team, maybe a little lower. Nobody really expected high things, but I don't think anyone expected what would happen to them in the following seasons. The Eternal started out the 2022 season 0-2, and after only 2 weeks on the season opening, they released DPS player Naga, signing Wub as his replacement. Now, shoutouts Wub, Wubheads Rise. He's a pretty good player, but asking him to fill in seamlessly on a bad team that doesn't even speak his language fully, with no synergy built, was a pretty tall ask. And not having Naga on the team left a lot of holes at flex DPS. Wub is a good player, but him and Naga did not have the same hero pool, and swapping one in for the other was not a great call. This team would continue to spiral even worse, going 0-5 before finally getting their first chance at a win against the Houston Outlaws. They went up 2-0, and they looked like they might get this win. Especially on top of the Outlaws, who were a pretty good team. This would be a great win for them. Unfortunately, they would get reverse swept, and would finish out the kickoff clash 0-6 without a win. Yeah, not a great start, huh? Well, they clearly agreed, and right before the midseason madness started, the Eternal would release Glister, signing DPS player Dove to take his place. I really feel bad for Glister. He didn't really get much of a chance on the Eternal. He'd only just joined. At least his modeling career after the Overwatch League seems to be going well. After losing a game against the LA Gladiators, the 0-7 Eternal faced off against the 1-6 New York Excelsior in one of the worst matches of all time. Both teams battled across 5 long maps, trying to see which of these teams would suffer yet another embarrassing loss. The New York Excelsior fighting to not be the worst team in the league, and the Paris Eternal fighting to not be the worst team ever. The Paris Eternal managed to come out on top with a clutch performance from their brand new DPS player, Dove, who played really well to secure the Eternal their first win of the season. Fans were feeling a little optimistic. Finally, that win happened. Now that they got one out of the way, maybe a couple more should come. But little did fans know, this would be the last win the Eternal would ever get. The Eternal would lose the rest of their games in the midseason madness, and go into the halfway point of the 2022 season at a pretty terrible 1-11 record. After 2 more losses, the Eternal would announce that they were dropping their entire roster, releasing Vistola, Dawn, Dredro, and Khan. During this, Wub put out a tweet that said "Objective Survive," and I feel like that's how most of their players were feeling. They ended up signing most of the Odyssey core, which was an NA Contenders team. The players they signed were Crawley, Malthul, Luke Mino, and Rakatak. This team was basically thrown into the fire. Joining a new team at the highest level with no real coaching, no time to get any synergy, and being given basically no help. These guys had to fend for themselves, so it wasn't really that surprising when they lost every single game for the rest of the season. That's right, the Eternal would lose their next 12 straight games and would finish the season 1-23. I felt so bad for the poor players on the team because they were really trying, doing their absolute best to win, but they had no help, no management, no leadership, and they just couldn't take out these Overwatch League teams. Think about this. This is mostly a contenders team that had been thrown on one of the worst franchises of all time and just told to give it a try. One of the worst situations possible, and after the disaster of this 2022 season, you'd think that things could only go up from here. But somehow, it got even worse. In 2023, it was announced that the Paris Eternal would be moving from Paris to Vegas, renaming themselves as the Vegas Eternal. Not only did this team go almost winless, but then they would abandon their French fans and would make a move that was so pointless that I don't really understand why they did it. Well, I say that, I know exactly why they did it. It was for money. However, this team was so bad that a move like this just didn't matter. In the offseason, they barely changed their team. Wub and Crawley would end up leaving, and they would sign Vulcan to play tank. That's it. That's all the moves they would make after having a basically winless team the previous season. Man, talk about setting up their team for failure, huh? That's all they did, and they ran it back with the same team. To say that no one expected much of this team would be an understatement. After an 0-2 start, one of their DPS players, Malthul, was having internet issues. So the manager, Avala, had to sub in. She ended up playing support, and their flex support player, Luke Mino, swapped over to play DPS. And they put up a bit of a fight, but they were against the London Spitfire, they didn't really have much of a choice, and they went down to 0-3. Despite basically being left to fend for themselves, some of the Vegas Eternal players still played as hard as they could. Notably, Rakatak, Dove, and Luke Mino had lots of highlights throughout the year, looking a lot better than the team around them. But it was basically all to no avail. After starting out 0-8, the Vegas Eternal decided to make even more roster changes as they prepared for the summer stage. For starters, Luke Mino ended up moving over to the San Francisco Shock. On top of that, they released Malthul and Vulcan, leaving only Dove and Rakatak remaining on the team. They signed some young, talented Korean players, those being Knife, Irony, Tuyu, and Finale, but basically all of them would be playing on ping for most of the year. And on top of that, the really shitty Eternal management and leadership that they had to deal with did not help. People thought that maybe these acquisitions would be enough to win at least one game, and they did help. Knife was an absolute monster, and people still underrate the impact that Tuyu had. They had several close games, and after starting out 0-10, an opportunity to win finally arrived. They would be facing off against the equally terrible LA Valiant, who at this time were 1-12. This was it. Their best chance to finally get that win. up against a team which, in all honesty, on paper, was worse than them. The quality of their players was worse than this team, and they proved it right away by taking a nice 2-0 lead. But the Vegas Eternal are cursed. A franchise so bad that they make the Cleveland Browns look normal. The LA Valiant would end up with one of the best reverse sweeps in Overwatch League history, stealing the win right from underneath these poor Eternal players, and you could just see them giving up by the end. Look at Rack Attack, look at how little joy he has left. This is what the Vegas Eternal did to their players. The Eternal would continue to spiral and spiral until they finished out the 2023 season with a record of 0-16, meaning that throughout 2022 and 2023, the Vegas Eternal would finish with a combined record of 1-39, basically rivaling the 0-40 Dragons, and they played worse throughout most of their time than the Dragons did. At the end of the season, the Vegas Eternal disbanded, and their players were finally free, with players like Knife, Rack Attack, Lucamino, and Wub finding success after leaving this cursed organization. It would later come out that the people who ran the Eternal ran it pretty terribly, which we kinda all knew looking at the results. The people in charge ran this team to the ground with poor leadership and no help for the players. Several of their former players would come out and complain about the management and the leaders, citing specifically that Avala was also a huge problem, and that there was just so many factors that made the Eternal so fucking terrible. All in all, it was really sad to see what was once a fun and lovable underdog team full of great European and superstar Korean talent go out in such a sad way. I doubt there are many fans left by the end of the Overwatch League, but at least Paris Eternal fans always have the 2020 Summer Showdown to remember. One of the best matches, and as long as you just forget about the rest of their history, you can always look at that and be happy. With all that said though, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and you want more like it, do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel. Your support goes a long way, and it means the world to me. If you got any future video ideas or just want to let me know that you enjoyed, leave a comment down below, it helps out a lot. With that said though, that's all for me. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, love you guys.